Hey, this is Trav here, and just a quick reminder that this podcast relies on the kindness of my Patreons, and I would like to thank the following people: Bill, Brendan, Grant, Lisa, Mog, Dan, and Paula. Your constant monthly donation really helps out, and if you can spare $1, the link to my Patreon is in the description. Anyway, thanks for listening. Here's the show. Hey, welcome to episode 169 of Tales from the Mind Boat, the slow-moving boat ride into the foggy, sleepless, groggy thoughts of my mind. This is Trav Nash speaking, and thank you very much for listening to this episode. It really does mean a lot to me, and I do appreciate it. And today's show is all about 5 days I spent in hospital, being kept awake, being monitored, and listening to the constant beeps and the sound of a guy constantly on his phone in the bed next to me. So it's a good show, and all you need to do is sit back, relax, think about your health as we set sail. All that is in front of me is one of those standard black and white analog clocks, constantly ticking away every second I have until I can be released again. The second hand makes a sharp, distinct click for every second that drops away as it makes its way around the clock. The only disruption to the routine is a slight stutter whenever it passes over the top of the minute hand. This soon becomes a pleasant, comforting sound that develops its own rhythm and soon becomes some kind of instrumental drum that coincides with the random beeping and occasional hospital announcements about code greys and staff needed. The ticking was always present. It was unavoidable to hear, even when the ward was full of nurses and beeping machines under those blinding white fluorescent lights. The ticking was always going to be there. That steady rhythmic beat kept on its predictable path until it began to stammer and click off beat every 60 seconds or so. The ticking slowly dragged and made time stretch out to become longer and more tiring than it already was. There was little around to break this long chain of moments that were chained together with an identical piece of a long thread of time. There was enough of a disruption when the clock hands passed over one another to the sterile silence that evoked dangerous ideas of rebellion and escape, and images began to blossom inside my head. In my mind's eye I could see splashes of pink paint stripes over those blank white walls. Something to brighten up those walls. At the very least, some kind of painting. Any kind of painting, from an op shop or even a first-year art student. Anything would be better than nothing to cover those eggshell white walls. These bursts of longing for an alternative soon faded away as the stutter stops and the clock hands pass over each other, and everything just feels the same and boring again. And you have little reason to try and change this fact. For 5 days I have to stay in this uncomfortable hospital bed, hooked up with wires from my head to my feet, all plugged into the long green snake-like cord that runs into a wall that delivers all my vital signs into their great machine of all-knowing, this all-great and powerful Oz. I've been here before, those boring walls, the uncomfortable hospital bed, the wires that tangle and restrict your movement. This time it's different though. This time I'm completely helpless. I'm not allowed to get up and walk around, even go into the bathroom. Any time I get up requires the button next to my bed to be pressed and signal one of the nurses to come and stand in the bathroom with me, which is up there one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever done in my life. I can understand why people who get put into nursing homes get cranky, because having any of your independence taken away and being watched like a child learning how to go potty is quite humiliating. Their faces are blank and experienced with doing this every day, but have a secret longing for you to fall over or break into a seizure, just to give them something substantial to do. Luckily for me, I kept my footing, and my sanity for as long as I could. From Monday to Thursday night, I was being deprived of my sleep. I could only sleep from 2 AM to 6 AM in the morning. Maybe in my 20s, when I could go for days of little to no sleep, thanks to my insomnia and self-destructive lifestyle, I could probably do this. These days, I sleep too much, if anything. I spend as much time in bed as I can. I'm constantly run down and mentally and physically deflated. Staying awake for 12 hours these days is a challenge for me, let alone staying awake for 20 hours for 4 days straight. It would have been easily to accomplish if I had access to my Steam library of games or the PlayStation, but I was without any major electrical devices other than my phone and my free-to-play phone games that hold your playtime for ransom unless you pay real-world money or wait a minimum 4 hours until you can play again. All I had was my sketchbook and my phone with comic books to read and the audiobook version of Game of Thrones to listen to, and probably 100 podcasts to catch up on. As much as I like to draw, there is only so much you can draw in one day until you drain the well of creativity, and reading or listening to audiobooks can very easily put you to sleep no matter how interesting or action-packed they are. The minute I would doze off was the minute a nurse would come rushing in and wake me up repeating my name, and I'd be stuck somewhere between the land of dreams and the land of the living. And with every hour that passed that I remained awake, the lines between these two worlds blurred, and I soon lost all measurement of time and awareness. I was only barely conscious enough to repeat who I was and where I was every time they checked my blood pressure or administered my medication. But aside from that, I was left to lay there, watching the clock, looking at the whiteboard with my name in front of it, and the red tick inside the box next to the word sleep deprivation. The only way to combat the waves of sleep that were there trying to take me down every 3 seconds was to drink as many cups of coffee that were offered. It became like an Olympic event. It became a challenge that I took up. Whenever one of the volunteers went past and asked if I wanted tea or coffee, I would surprise myself at how fast I could say coffee, like a man possessed, like someone who has been lost at sea and finally returned back to civilization again, and all he wants is a cup of coffee. I would ask for just simple black coffee, and I would let it cool underneath my nose as I breathed in the steam, and it swirled around inside my vast cave networks of tunnels inside my skull, until it found a secret doorway to my brain, and lit up those areas that were dormant, until they twinkled in the dark areas like Christmas lights. As soon as the coffee kicked in, I was wide awake for the next few hours, full of this nervous energy and twitching hands that shook the nervous energy off my fingers like oversized jewelry. The energy had nowhere to go, and so it spun around my body trying to motivate me to spring up and move about. But it was a losing battle, as this was some kind of fake energy masking the fact that even after one day, I was extremely tired, and even the short bursts of energy from the coffee weren't enough to conjure up all the energy I would need to completely stand up. That would require some kind of committee meeting with my whole body present to come to some kind of agreement that it was worth spending their limited resources on. And the verdict was always that they had little to waste on sudden impulses to get up, only to be told to get back down again by one of the nurses. It was a losing battle that inevitably meant I just had to lay there and become ultra aware of even the smallest detail of the room. My limited scope from where I was stuck meant I could only look at the same panoramic view day in and day out. The finer details is what I became accustomed with. Even when something was slightly moved, it gave the room enough of a change to start searching for those details again, like a spot the difference you would find in one of those old newspaper kids sections. I was stuck in a room with no windows, just blinking lights from machines and fluorescent white lights. An older man was in the bed to the back of the room, but he was too busy on his phone for most of the week to chat to me. He seemed to be some kind of guy who finds specific second-hand cars for clients and gets some kind of finder's fee for doing this. His voice was loud and sounded like any generic dad you would hear on Australian soap operas like Neighbours or Home and Away. Whenever he made a phone call, he always began that conversation with a loud, out of nowhere, "Hey buddy." I was never quite sure if he was talking to me, as I was the only one else in the room. Sometimes his curtain was pulled over, so half the time I was unsure he was actually talking to me, until he continued the conversation without any of my input. Though when he did talk to me, I gave him very short answers to his questions. I was too tired to really engage proficiently, and besides, he seemed to enjoy talking to the nurses, who were always so kind and nice to him, and would take the time to tell him about their day and places they've been on holidays. And whatever the subject was, he seemed to always be an expert on it, or he had first-hand experience, or either lived there himself, passed through, worked there, or knows someone who knows someone who knows. The nurses seemed kind to him, because that's their job, and they listened without judgment, and I was amazed how patient and polite they were with his tales that seemed to go nowhere, or had vague connections to anything anybody else said. He seemed to be someone who talked for the sake of talking, regardless if it was important or anyone was interested. He was far more lucid than I was, though, on the account that he could sleep whenever he felt tired. They had him in for different reasons than myself, and they even allowed him more freedom, even to go to the bathroom himself, which he proudly strutted to whenever he could. At night, while the ward was quiet and dark, he snored like a hibernating winter bear, sometimes sounding like he was choking on his own phlegm or spittle. A few times the nurse came in to make sure he was okay, and he woke up fine, and then fell back to sleep as easily as he was awoken. He managed some kind of great balancing act of snoring and sometimes farting at the same time, and I was glad my sense of smell was almost non-existent, otherwise my vital signs might have dropped off the map. All I could do was just lay there with my headphones, try not to tangle myself in coloured wires or my phone charger, listening to podcasts about crimes of passion and interviews of humble celebrities who got everything they ever wanted and realised it wasn't enough and it was all a sham. The tiny holes in the ceiling was my spy holes to somewhere else, and if I focused hard enough in my dreamlike state, I could see somewhere else, small flashes of blue skies and glimpses of still blue oceans, and the sweet natural smells that overpower the sterile, stale hospital smell that had plugged my nostrils for the last few days. I floated out of my former self and began to rise up, and I was on my way to someplace better, until a nurse would come in and ask in a low whisper, "Are you asleep? You have an hour to go. After that hour you can go to sleep." "I'm not asleep," I said. "I'm just dreaming." "Do you want to go on the bike?" she would ask. And the next thing I knew, I found myself a 38-year-old man riding an exercise bike at 1 a.m, pedaling along to the sound of a loud ticking clock in the middle of a dark, quiet hospital ward. Each morning was a gradual build-up of noise. As the nurses returned to work, getting back to their duties, shifts changed and friendships had brief catch-ups and updates, and then one would leave and 2 more would enter. A breakfast tray would come and be dropped on the rolling table next to my bed by an old stone-faced woman. It looked like she had been doing this for more than 100 years, and with each tray she put in front of the sick and recovering, her soul died a little more until she became whatever she is today. I'd begin to open the tiny packaging for each individual piece of food that was placed before me, and slowly and carefully I ate it within the movement restrictions that were placed upon me. When I was finished, I placed the empty tray, now covered in open packets and margarine-stained knives, and a spoon with milk still sitting in a small pool in the middle of the indent, back on the table, waiting to be taken away again. I would always leave my coffee last. I would hold the mug of coffee and let the warmth run down my arm, and take small sips to savour the drink, as who knows when I'll be offered another one for the rest of the day. During the morning, the nurses might come in and ask how I slept the night before, knowing all too well it was terrible, and they tried their best to convey their sympathy and understanding that it's going to be hard for the next couple of days to get through. Sometimes a woman would come in completely ignoring me and carrying on an unrelated conversation with another nurse as she squirted more glue into my hair and pushed in hard to keep the wires in place. There was an instant smell of something that smelled a bit like turpentine that singed my nostril hairs and scraped along my tongue on the way out. Then she would vanish again, like I was never really there. Sometimes I wondered if that was a fact that I was never aware of and only coming to the conclusion now. The nurses came in and checked my vitals and asked if I needed anything, and then would be off to someplace else again. A researcher came in and asked if the car salesman and I would be willing to donate our DNA for some trial experiments they were doing to link our specific genetics to some kind of medication they were trying. The car salesman said yes before the guy could even explain his concept, and told him he should at least read the information before signing the document. The car salesman refused, which is weird for someone who does business, as I always assumed reading anything you sign would be the smart move with any kind of deal. I took time to read it and only agreed to give my DNA for this one specific research they were doing. It was the least I could do for staying in a hospital for no out-of-pocket expense, but I didn't feel comfortable having them keep my DNA for any other research purposes, or what they may use it for in the future. He came back to pick up the form, and he asked me if I wanted to give my blood or my saliva. I chose saliva as I assumed from watching police shows on TV. It was just done with cotton buds to the inside of my cheeks. But it's actually a plastic vial you need to fill with your own spit, which is a pretty gross thing to do, and you quickly run out of spit before you fill up the vial. Eventually I filled it and sealed the lid, which drops some kind of preserving liquid that floats on top of my sample. He took it away and thanked me, and now I am probably on some kind of database now. But at least I've done one small thing for science, and that's more than most, I guess. Sometimes a specialist would come in and give me some kind of comprehension test to fill in, or speak to me about how depressed or sane I considered I was, with a series of yes or no questions. At one point they brought in a machine that flashed white lights directly into your eyes, and I began to fill with panic. As I remembered the last time they did this, I ended up on the cold floor, being revived by a whole hospital staff standing over me. I tried to maintain control with what little control I had left, and made close attention to my breathing and tried to keep it as even as possible as I breathed in and out, which was kinda hard as they just tried to make me hyperventilate a few minutes before to see if I would pass out. My heart pounded around like a wild horse being fenced in, and it took so much concentration to ground myself in reality. I wasn't going to be taken down like before. I am the master of my mind, and I would try and beat this or go down swinging. I was commanded to close my eyes, and white light tried to penetrate through my eyelids that made me twitch, and then was told to open as the short burst of white light was inches away from my face now. I had to repeat this process about 10 times. Each time those bursts of white lights became faster and faster, almost like a strobe light in some sticky floored nightclub. Alarms rang in my head. A distinct high-pitched frequency whistled in both ears like a kettle coming to the boil. I gripped the bed sheets of my hand, and I could see the nurses ready to act if anything happened by just judging my face, and they knew I was frightened and fighting not to vanish away. I didn't want to go white and black out again. I didn't want it all to fade out. I don't want to be lost out there where there is no guarantee that I would ever come back again. I don't want the last thing I ever see to be some flashing white light that irritated my mind so much it gave up and shut everything down, and that was the end of my story. The final command to close and open my eyes was given, and I looked directly into the light for the last time, and I could feel my body trembling and running out of will to keep going, but somehow it did. I managed to hold in there, and it drained me of everything I had left that was keeping me going up to this point. When they wheeled the machine away, all I wanted to do was sleep, like I have never wanted to sleep before. It was the only distinct thought in my head, and it rattled round like a marble scraping the walls of my skull. Around that time my partner showed up and brought good coffee from a good cafe, and the smell and the instant hit of its bitter sweetness reminded me of everything that is left in the world that is still good and worth sticking around for. The coffee recharged me, and made everything come back into focus. Words and thoughts returned and multiplied, and structure and comprehension soon followed. I was wide awake again, and looked forward to finally getting some sleep on that final night in hospital. The last night I spent in hospital was a set-up sleep study where even more wires were placed on my face and around my chin and then under my eyes to monitor all this eye movement and teeth grinding while I slept. A belt was placed around my stomach to measure my breathing, and more wires were placed on my legs to see if I kicked in the air at night. When they were all done, they left, leaving me alone with only that camera that had always been there watching me, and that loud, clicking clock to tick away every second I have left to go before they will let me leave this bed and return to my regular old life again. No surprises I couldn't sleep though. I tossed and turned and felt like some kind of science fiction alien experiment was devouring my life essence. My mind babbled and loudly shouted throughout the night it wouldn't give me a break, and when it began to quieten down again I just focused on that ticking and beeping of the ward as its call echoed down the hallway and off into other sections of the hospital I hope I would never ever return to. At some point I did go to sleep, but was waking up at 6 a.m. again, and I was told today's the day I can finally go home. After eating my last breakfast, a team of about 10 different specialists came in and told me they've reviewed all the data in the morning and can confidently say I displayed no signs of epilepsy or any kind of abnormal neurological behaviour. They suggested that what might have triggered me before with past episodes was an extreme panic disorder that must have been left unmanaged for so long and reached a point where it was causing my body to just shut down and turn off all the lights. Thankfully, the combination of a new and old medication and the pacemaker still in my chest have certainly kept things working with much better proficiency, and the new anti-anxiety drugs I was on was now suggested that I should now try and focus on some more psychological therapy to try and regain control of my brain and try and distinguish between when my brain goes into hyper-panic mode and learn how to settle things back down again. I was cut free from the wires, leaving my hair all tangled in glue and bed sweat for not being allowed to shower for the past 5 days. I stood up and began to instantly pace around in circles, getting used to being vertical again. I dressed, put my shoes on, and decided to walk down the 7 flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator as I made my way to freedom and independence again. As my partner went into the hospital ground floor pharmacy to pick up the new medication they prescribed, I walked out to the blue skies on a crisp morning winter's day. The trams rattled in front of me, and I saw patients in leg casts smoking outside the hospital gate. The air was as fresh as it could be, being so close to a busy main road, but the sweet-smelling trees and grass from the park across the road beckoned me to be amongst it all. I stood under the cool shadows of the tree that lined a footpath that joggers and old men passed me by in various speeds and stages of their life. I looked back at the hospital I was once caged in, and hoped this would be the last time I would ever have to come back for a very long time. So that's it for another week. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope it was worth the wait. If you like this episode, then if you could do me a favor and like and subscribe, leave a review on the very device you're using would extremely help me out. Or just telling someone, recommending it to somebody who listens to podcasts, may not be aware of it. Just sending a text, a tweet, a Facebook post, just sending it to one person this week would really, really help me out. And I thank those who already do it for me. You can follow this podcast on Facebook and Twitter just by searching for Tales from the Mind Boat with Google or Facebook search or whatever the hell you're using these days. You can follow me on Twitter at Nashtopia. I'm on Facebook somewhere, and you can also follow my art diary on Instagram if you look up Trav Nash Draws Things. The theme music for this podcast is composed by Tim Witt. You can listen to his music right now on Bandcamp just by searching for Tim Witt Sounds. You can also listen to his music on SoundCloud, also by searching for Tim Witt Sounds. This episode was written, produced, edited, spoken, and dreamed up by me, Trav Nash. You're welcome. So that's it. Thank you again for listening to this episode. If you could spare as minimum as $1 to my Patreon, I'd really appreciate that, and it would really help things out as I begin to find a balance in my life again. But I hope you're doing well and you have a good week. I want you to stay safe. Until next week, be cool to each other. Peace.